So when a car company releases a refresh model, the outgoing car kind of gets no love, almost making it seem like it's not really any good anymore. So in 2024, Porsche released a refresh of the Cayenne, and it was quite extensive with a bunch of new stuff. So did that make the pre-refresh model no longer any good? So I've got one of each behind me. Let's compare and find out. Let's get started with a thank you to Porsche of downtown LA for giving me access to these two cars. If you happen to be interested in a Porsche product, I've left their information in the description below. So let's get started with the exterior changes between these two cars. The one on the left obviously is pre-refresh. The one on the right is the post-refresh 2024 model. So the refreshed gets boxier fenders, a new hood, and redesigned headlights that match that fender shape with a more squarish rectangular look to it. And out back, the taillight design is new, followed up with a subtle change where the Porsche lettering is exposed as opposed to being covered by the taillight in the pre-refresh model. Now, which one looks better? To me, I think the refresh looks a little bit better. I think I like to use the word more muscular as a way to describe it. But how much different is the refresh compared to the pre-refresh? I mean, putting them next to each other starts to highlight the differences a little bit, but I think they're still pretty subtle. If you look at the pre-refresh car, I think it still looks pretty good. What do you think? So now I'm on the inside of the 2024 refresh model. Let's cover the changes in here. So starting out with the technology. So there is a 12.6-inch curved widescreen all digital display that's replacing the old hybrid style gauges in the pre-refresh. The new gauges are from the Taycan and are making their way into basically every single Porsche product. And in my opinion, they're great. They're easy to use. There's no glare issues. The graphics are nice. They're just wonderful. Next is the opportunity to get a 10.9-inch passenger screen that didn't exist in the pre-refresh models. And a lot of car manufacturers are moving to this passenger display, and in my opinion, I think it's kind of a gimmick, and I bet you they're very rarely used even for the people who do option them in. Now there are some additional tactile changes. The shifter is up on the dash. The AC controls have been revised and simplified. A lot less buttons in here now versus the pre-refresh where everything was basically controlled with a button or a switch or a knob, and now it's either integrated into the screen or basically cleaned up. Now, even though I am a button and a tactile type person for the interior, I do like the buttons and the knobs, I do have to admit that the cleaned up look in the center section is a little bit more appealing. Now let's wrap it up with the rest of the changes on the left side of the steering wheel, where the ignition is a push button start as standard across the entire Cayenne lineup. Gone is the knob style ignition, and I'm kind of upset about this. And even though the ignition remains on the left side, I still think that the knob is a part of that experience, that whole experience of the ignition being on the left side. But now it's making its way into the 911, and there's basically no turning back. And speaking of the 911, the steering wheel is adopted from it and has a mode selector as standard across the entire Cayenne lineup. Otherwise, some of the things I haven't really touched on or gone into much detail, things like the infotainment system, the overall legroom, the size, the interior cabin, the trunk, all of that stuff remains the same whether you're pre-refresh or post-refresh. So now that we've covered the exterior changes and the interior changes, let's see if we can feel the difference behind the wheel, starting out with the pre-refresh model and then jumping into the post-refresh. All right, so we are in the pre-refreshed car first. I wanted to drive this one first and then get into the 2024 refresh model right afterwards so I can get that immediate difference between the two. So as a reminder, this is the same 3-liter turbocharged 6-cylinder that generates 335 horsepower and 332 pounds-feet of torque. It is riding on the base suspension, no air suspension, just like the 2024 I'm going to drive. I wanted it to be as close of a comparison as possible. So let's go ahead and start it up and go for a roll. Ignition on the left. And the turnkey knob is just such an underrated thing. I think it's going to be one of those you don't realize how cool it is until you lose it type of things. And I also feel the same way about the analog tachometer. I think Porsche did a wonderful job when they tried to go with a hybrid style approach between the tachometer being analog and the two flanking screens to the left and the right being the digital displays. And I don't know, I certainly feel like I'm going to miss it. There's just something about an analog tachometer that's just really cool. So let's go ahead and do vehicle in sport, and let's test acceleration. Foot to the floor, a little slow to get rolling. All right, that was pretty quick. So this is the base model Cayenne, and I'm going to go back around and test it one more time to give a better feel. But at initial, I guess, throttle input, when you put your foot to the floor, there is a little bit of a lag, and it takes a second for it to get rolling. But once it gets rolling, it's got plenty of get up. Let's go from a roll. Yeah, I mean, it's not slow by any stretch of the imagination. As long as you have your expectations checked. Of course, this is the base model, and Porsche makes a lot more faster models. They've got the S, the GTS, all these other wonderful trims that they do. But let's give it one more pull. From a roll again, from first gear. And the transmission shifts fast as well. So, yeah, I mean, I also drove this prior to starting or hitting the record button. And I can tell you that the speed is more than enough. This is the same engine that Porsche uses in the Cayenne. I'm sorry, not in the Cayenne, in the Panamera. And I have a lot of experience driving a base Panamera, and it's just a wonderful engine. For all daily driving situations, it performs admirably. So when you're driving on the street from stop and go traffic, it's got plenty of down low torque, 332 pounds-feet of torque. When you're merging onto the highway, it's got plenty of get up to get you rolling. And also, if you wanted to kind of pass or get your blood pumping a little bit, it's got plenty of power to do that too. And remember, this is still a Porsche product, so it's got a lot of that Porsche DNA, that sportiness built into it. And there's a railroad crossing here. I think I'm gonna have to go back in the other direction. So yeah, let's do that. We don't want to wait for the train. All right, so yeah, from a speed standpoint, the base trim level is more than enough. Now let's switch over and talk about the suspension, right? So as a reminder, this is the base suspension, no air ride. I don't even have the ability to change the modes, and in reality, this doesn't have the mode selector, so all the mode does when I switched it over into sport is it'll make the steering a little bit tighter and the throttle response a little sharper. Now, how does the base suspension feel? It actually feels wonderful. So from a daily driving standpoint, and I keep saying daily driving because even though this is a Porsche product, it's still the base model, and it's an SUV, it's a heavy car. So the expectation, at least my expectation of a car like this, is that yes, I expect it to do daily driving really nicely, and at the same time, give me that Porsche nature, that sportiness that the Porsche badge is associated with. And I think it does it great. I mean, it hits all of those marks perfectly, at least in my opinion. It's very comfortable to drive in. I'm driving on uneven roads here in the city streets of downtown LA, which are pretty bad considering other parts of the country. And it soaks up the bumps nicely. I'm sitting in a 14-way seat, which I highly recommend over a base seat in any of the Porsche models. 14 and 18-way seats provide a significant difference in terms of comfort, and I don't know about quality in the long term, but definitely in comfort, it is an upgrade, and of course adjustability. But going back to the suspension, yeah, I think it drives wonderfully. And expectation is something I want to make sure is in line here, because remember earlier on I said Porsche and sporty driving and things like that. It's alive and well here. Even in the base model, Porsche cars have a sportier feeling. For example, if you're jumping in from a BMW X5, this is going to feel a little bit sportier than a BMW X5 in terms of the suspension. It is a little firmer. The steering wheel is a little bit heavier. When you're going into turns, the steering feedback is a little different. It's a little sharper. It's a little sportier. So as long as you have your expectations checked, The Cayenne delivers a great driving experience for a daily driver SUV, family SUV, and this platform that Volkswagen has developed and shares across multiple cars, ranging all the way up to the Bentley Bentayga and of course the more expensive models of the Cayenne. It's a great platform that offers great scalability, great extensibility, and overall it's just a great car. Whether you're looking at 2023 pre-refresh or 2024, I really like the Cayenne. So come to a stoplight. Now I think is a good time to transition over into the 2024 and see what that drives like. All right, so now we are in the 2024 refreshed Cayenne. So as a quick rundown and a reminder, this is the same engine, 3-liter, 6-cylinder turbocharged unit. It generates more horsepower, 348 horsepower, 368 pounds-feet of torque. If you're keeping track of the math, it's 13 extra horsepower and 36 additional pounds-feet of torque, if I remember correctly. And the suspension is also a little different. So as standard, the refreshed Cayennes now get a fixed suspension still, but with PASM added on. So it's naturally going to feel a little different. And even further, Porsche says that the PASM suspension has been tuned a little differently even compared to the pre-refresh. So they say it's a little bit more comfortable in the comfort setting and a little sportier in the sport setting. So we'll put that to the test here, but I also want to see the difference between the two, riding them back to back here. So we are going to drive it on the same road. The car is already on, so let's get rolling here. And we're going to start off the same way with a quick acceleration. So drive mode, I'm going to put it in sport like I did the other one, and I can sense the car downshift, and the chassis automatically went into Sport Plus, so that is the PASM. And now let's go ahead and do a quick launch from a stop in first gear. Okay, so that initial lag that I mentioned from driving the pre-refresh, it's the same here. There is a little bit of a delay when you're getting up to start rolling, but let's go back again. This is a little bit of a roll, 6 miles an hour mash. Still, again, I mean, it feels the same. It doesn't feel any different. From an acceleration standpoint, and I think Porsche also says this in their published 0 to 60 time for the Cayenne, the base one that is, it's the same thing. The 13 additional horsepower is not going to make a difference. Let's go again. Yeah, it feels the same. It feels identical, actually. All right, now one place where it feels a little different is the download torque. So that almost 40 additional pounds-feet of torque, I can tell the difference. And where you feel that is in stop-and-go traffic, at a stoplight, when you're rolling. You press on the throttle pedal, and it feels a little bit more urgent to get up and roll. I'm assuming that has maybe something to do with a little bit of the throttle response tuning and just overall the additional torque as well. But that is one area where the additional power per se makes a little bit of a difference. So when I come to a stop here and I press the throttle to get rolling, I do feel that just that additional 40 pounds-feet of torque is making a difference. But from an acceleration and speed standpoint, it feels the same. So now let's flip over into the suspension, because this has PASM and it also is tuned a little differently. And I have to agree with that I guess notion or that tinkering that Porsche has done with the suspension. And I'm assuming PASM has a little bit to do with that. You're comparing adaptive shocks to non-adaptive shocks, so naturally it probably is going to feel a little bit more comfortable. But there's definitely a difference in comfort compared to the pre-refresh one I drove. This one feels a little softer. It does feel a little cushionier, for the lack of a better term. And I feel like this is a little bit more compliant compared to the pre-refresh. and in normal mode, kind of lofts along. This seems like a softer ride than the pre-refresh car that I drove. Now in sport mode, it's completely different. When I put the chassis in Sport Plus, it really does get stiffer compared to the base that I drove, where it didn't have PASM or any type of suspension adjustment ability. It definitely feels a lot sportier here. And again, as I mentioned, I drove the base prior to hitting record. I also drove this a little bit prior to hitting record, and definitely this one's sportiness factor is a lot higher. The bandwidth is a lot bigger, and the threshold between the two ends of the spectrum is a little bit wider in this compared to the base car. So when I mentioned earlier, comfort is a little bit more comfortable, and sport is, in my opinion, a lot sportier. So overall, it does feel a little torquier down low, and the suspension for daily driving, I suppose, it is a little bit more comfortable and compliant. I would say, if I had to put a percentage on it, maybe 10% more compliant. 10, 15 is a little bit of a stretch, but let's call it 10 to 15% more compliant compared to the base car that I drove a little earlier. So that's pretty much it in terms of the driving dynamics. Now let's wrap it up with some final thoughts. So that's the refreshed 2024 Porsche Cayenne. Now this thing has a base price of $86,000 now, which is a $14,000 difference compared to a 2023 model, which started at $72,000. So is it worth it? Now, it's kind of a tough situation. If you're thinking about buying a refresh model just for the slight power bump and the suspension changes, then I would say pump the brakes a little bit, drive them back to back, see which one you like. Unless you're totally fixated on a softer riding car, then the refresh is the one for you. Now, if you're thinking about the S model, the equation changes a little bit because that thing has a V8 and it's a little different. But let's stick with the base model and jump on the interior. If you like a cleaned up center stack with less buttons, if you like more screens, more technology, the push button start is what you're looking for, you don't mind that it doesn't have a knob switch anymore, then the refresh, again, may be what you're looking for. So it all depends on what's more important for you, the technology or maybe a little bit more power or some sportiness. So that's all I've got. If you've got any questions about the refresh Cayenne, please drop me a comment down below or send me a message on Instagram @DriveSteady. If you're interested in a 24 refreshed V8S Cayenne, here's a link to a video I did not too long ago. Check that out. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for watching this video. Until next time, drive steady.